It was 4 in the afternoon when I carried the last box out of the house on Larkspur Lane. The light in Connecticut in October has a particular color, a kind of thin gold that makes even dying grass look expensive. It fell across the slate roof, across the boxwood hedges I had trimmed myself every spring for 11 years, across the black Range Rover idling in the circular drive with the engine already running because Grant hated to be kept waiting. Even for this. He stood on the top step in his charcoal suit, one hand in his pocket, the other holding a phone he wasn't looking at. The watch on his wrist was the one I'd bought him in Geneva for our 5th anniversary, back when I still thought marriage was a series of gifts you gave each other until you'd built something that couldn't be undone. He didn't walk me to the car. He never did. He hadn't walked me anywhere in April, when I was on the table for my second retrieval, and he was in Scottsdale closing the Meridian deal. He hadn't called after the transfer failed in June, when I sat in the parking garage of Greenwich Fertility for 40 minutes, because I didn't trust myself to drive. He hadn't said a word the night his mother told the entire table at Thanksgiving that some women simply weren't built for children, and looked directly at me while she said it, and he'd just refilled his wine glass and asked someone to pass the potatoes. I wheeled my suitcase down the flagstone path, the wheels catching on the seams between stones, and that was when I saw her. She was standing near the hydrangeas, half hidden, wearing a loose ivory sweater that did nothing to hide the curve underneath it. Brielle, 26 years old, Grant's junior marketing coordinator 18 months ago, now 7 months pregnant with what the ultrasound technician had apparently confirmed were 2 heartbeats. She had one hand pressed to the small of her back the way pregnant women do in their 3rd trimester, and the other resting on her belly like she was still getting used to the size of it. Her face, in that gold afternoon light, looked pale and a little frightened. She looked at me. I looked at her. There was something complicated in her expression. Not quite triumph. Something closer to a kid who'd won a prize she was starting to suspect wasn't what she thought it was. I didn't say anything. I opened the car door. My car. The silver Mercedes he'd bought me 2 Christmases ago. The one thing in the settlement that was unambiguously mine, and slid into the driver's seat. Vivian. His voice carried across the drive, low and even, the same tone he used to close 8-figure deals. Finance is processing the wire this afternoon. You'll see it by end of day. I shut the door. The engine swallowed whatever else he might have said. In the rearview mirror, the house grew smaller. The house I had decorated room by room, the house where I had hosted 40 Christmas parties and 11 anniversaries, and exactly 0 birthdays for a child of my own, until the road curved and it was gone. The odometer read just under 2,000 miles. I hadn't driven much these last few years. Grant's company had grown from a regional developer into something that got written up in the business section, and with that growth came more dinners, more galas, more evenings where I stood next to him in a dress he'd approved and smiled at people whose names I would forget by morning. I managed the house. I managed his mother, Diane, who called twice a day with complaints disguised as concern. I fielded the aunts at every holiday who asked, with varying degrees of subtlety, when there might be good news. I had become something like a piece of furniture in the Whitlock family's front hall. Well-maintained, tastefully arranged, and, unfortunately, defective in the one function that would have justified the investment. Traffic on I-95 was lighter than I expected. I turned on the radio. Some classic rock station was playing Fleetwood Mac, that line about being afraid of changing because you'd built your life around someone. I turned it off. 11 years, 23 to 34. I had folded up the best years of my life and put them in a box marked Whitlock, and today the lease was up. It was time to take the box back. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, over and over, a small, relentless insect. I didn't need to check it to know who it was. He'd probably realized by now how fast I'd signed, or his mother had already called him screaming. Or maybe he simply wasn't used to a woman who'd been quiet and agreeable for 11 years, walking away without a single tear. I had sent him one message before I turned my phone off entirely. 3 sentences. I told him the second transfer, in June, had actually taken. That it had implanted. That there had been a heartbeat for exactly 19 days. And that the fertility specialist had privately told me, after running the genetic panel a second time, because the numbers were strange, that the embryo's chromosomal abnormalities were consistent with a very high sperm DNA fragmentation index. His, not mine. That the pregnancy had stopped developing at 8 weeks, and that even if it hadn't, the specialist had gently suggested we consider whether carrying to term was medically advisable given what the fragmentation panel showed. I told him his mother would never have forgiven a child who came with complications, and that he would never have stood between them. My last line was, "As for the 15 million, you can think of it as the debt you owe that child, since you'll never have to pay him back yourself." He'd absolutely seen it. By the time my flight pushed back from the gate, there were 31 missed calls on my phone, all from the same number, and a string of texts that moved from confusion to disbelief to something that read like a man coming apart in real time. The last one, sent at 1:14 in the morning, said only, "Viv, I can't breathe." I turned the phone off completely. Couldn't breathe. Grant, when you were in a hotel suite in Scottsdale with a 24-year-old who thought you hung the moon, did it ever once occur to you that I might be having trouble breathing too? When you were signing term sheets while I sat in a corridor at Greenwich Fertility gripping the handrail because my legs had stopped working properly, a nurse handed me a paper cup of water and told me my color was bad, that I should call someone to come get me. I told her there wasn't anyone. At that moment you were still, on paper, my husband. You were never, in any way that mattered, my family. The plane landed at Leonardo da Vinci Airport a little after 9 at night, local time. The arrivals hall had that particular fluorescent glow that makes everyone look slightly unwell, and the customs line moved in fits and starts, 100 different languages tangled together over the smell of espresso and jet fuel. I pulled my suitcase off the carousel and immediately found Matteo in the crowd. He was wearing a dark wool coat and the same navy scarf I'd borrowed from him once, years ago, during a January in Rome I'd never quite let myself forget. He was holding up a piece of printer paper with 2 words on it in block letters, Vivian Whitlock. Exactly the way he'd held up a sign the day he picked me up from my study abroad orientation, 16 years earlier, both of us 20 years old and certain we had all the time in the world. His hair was a little longer than I remembered, threaded with gray at the temples, but he still stood the way he always had, like a man who'd never once needed to slouch to make someone else comfortable. When he saw me, he smiled, and the corners of his eyes crinkled, and something in my chest that had been clenched for roughly 11 years loosened by about half an inch. I pushed the cart toward him. "You actually came." "When have I ever not shown up?" he said, folding the sign and shoving it into his coat pocket as he took the cart from me. 11-hour flight. You must be wrecked. I brought you something hot, it's in the car. Come on." He turned and started walking, slower than his natural pace, so I could keep up. The automatic doors slid open and a wall of cold, damp November air hit us. I flinched and pulled my coat tighter around my neck. He glanced back, and without a word unwound his scarf and handed it to me. "Put that on. You've always run cold in the neck." It was still warm from his body, faintly smelling of cedar and coffee. I wrapped it around myself and felt warmth spread through my chest in a way that had nothing to do with the fabric. The car was a gray Alfa Romeo. Older. Unremarkable. The kind of car a man drives when he's decided he doesn't need anyone to be impressed. On the passenger seat, exactly as promised, sat a paper cup of hot chocolate, wrapped in a cardboard sleeve. I picked it up and drank. It was sweet and almost too hot, and it traveled down my throat and settled somewhere in my chest like a small fire. He started the engine and glanced sideways at me, his eyes lingering on my face for 2 or 3 seconds too long. "You've lost weight." "Have I?" "Your jaw's sharper. But that's fine. Rome has good food. I'll have you fixed in 3 months. I didn't answer, just leaned my head back against the seat and watched the scenery slide by in the dark. Low buildings, cypress trees black against a navy sky, the last orange line of daylight still hanging on the horizon. Some Italian song played quietly on the radio, unhurried and a little melancholy. I didn't understand the words, but they sounded like they meant something. "Did the wire come through?" he asked eventually. "I saw the notification before you boarded." "Good." He didn't ask anything else, and I didn't offer anything else. We had a kind of shorthand between us, built over 16 years in fragments. A semester here, a wedding he came to that he probably shouldn't have, a handful of visits over the years when Grant was traveling, and I'd told myself it was just an old friend passing through. Matteo always knew when to ask and when to simply exist beside me until I was ready. Of everyone I had ever known, he was the only one who could do that without making it feel like a performance. The car wound through the city, streetlights scattering through bare plane trees, throwing broken light across the windshield. My eyes grew heavy. "Sleep if you want. I'll wake you when we're there." I murmured something and let myself go under. I met Grant Whitlock at a hospital fundraiser. My college roommate dragged me to the spring of my junior year, a black tie affair in a downtown hotel ballroom that felt, at 20, like stepping into a different species of life entirely. He was 29, already running the development company his father had built and was slowly handing off to him, and he had the particular gift, which I would only later understand as a kind of professional skill rather than a personal one, of making whoever he was speaking to feel like the only interesting person in the room. He asked about my coursework. He asked what I actually wanted to do with an architecture degree, rather than what I thought I was supposed to say I wanted to do with it. He remembered, 3 weeks later, the specific detail I'd mentioned about a studio project I was struggling with, and sent, unprompted, a contact at a firm that ended up giving me my first real internship. It felt, at 20, like being seen for the first time by someone whose attention actually mattered in the world. We married 2 years later, the June after I graduated, in a ceremony his mother had more input into than I did, at a country club I'd never once expressed a preference for over any other. I told myself at the time that this was simply how it worked when you married into a family with this much money and this much history. You let the details go, because the marriage itself was the thing that mattered, and Diane's opinions about flowers and seating charts were a small price for a life that otherwise looked, from the outside, like exactly what everyone told me I should want. The first few years were, if not entirely happy, at least busy enough that I didn't examine the difference too closely. Grant worked constantly. I finished my degree, took the internship, worked for 18 months at a small residential firm in the city before Diane began, with increasing frequency, to comment on how tired I looked. How a woman shouldn't have to split her attention between a career and a household of this size. How surely I understood that Grant needed a wife who could manage the demands of his position rather than compete with them. I quit at 26. I told myself it was my decision. Looking back, I can trace, almost to the month, how many separate conversations it actually took to arrive at a decision I'd been carefully walked into rather than one I'd made freely. The house on Larkspur Lane came the same year. 8,000 square feet. 6 bedrooms for 2 people who, at the time, still fully intended to fill at least a few of them. I decorated every room myself, genuinely enjoyed doing it, found in it an outlet for the design instincts I'd otherwise set aside, and told myself that this, too, counted as building something, even if nobody outside the house would ever know my name was attached to it. The children didn't come easily. We started trying properly around year 4, and by year 6, when nothing had happened, Diane began, at first delicately, and then with less and less delicacy, to raise the subject at every family gathering, usually phrased as concern for my well-being rather than criticism, though everyone at the table always understood exactly what she meant. Grant, for his part, simply went quiet whenever it came up, which I initially mistook for tact, and eventually recognized as something closer to relief that someone else was doing the difficult work of pressuring me, so he didn't have to. We started IVF in year 8. The first round failed at the transfer stage. The second round, in year 9, resulted in a pregnancy that ended at 6 weeks. A loss I processed largely alone, in a bathroom at a work dinner Grant hadn't wanted to skip, texting him from a stall to say I thought something was wrong, receiving a reply 40 minutes later that said, "Call the doctor. I'll check in after this wraps up." He checked in the next morning. By then, it was already over. The third round, the one that actually mattered, happened the spring before I left, and by then I had learned enough about my own husband to keep certain things to myself until I had a use for them. I didn't tell him, at first, that the transfer had worked. I wanted to see, I think, on some level I wasn't proud of, how long it would take him to notice I was different, quieter, more careful with myself, avoiding the wine at dinner without offering an explanation. It took him 5 weeks. He noticed finally, not because he'd been paying close attention, but because Diane, sharper than her son in every respect that mattered, commented over a Sunday dinner that I looked like I might finally be pregnant. And only then did he turn to actually look at me properly, for what felt like the first time in longer than either of us wanted to admit. By then, the fertility specialist had already run the extended genetic panel a second time, puzzled by results that didn't line up with what my own blood work suggested they should. By then, I already knew, quietly, privately, in the particular loneliness of information you're not ready to share with the person it will hurt most, that the fragmentation numbers on Grant's side were high enough to explain everything. Not just this pregnancy's eventual failure at 8 weeks, but likely the 2 that had come before it as well. Years of doctors delicately suggesting we consider donor sperm as an option. Years of Diane's insinuations landing squarely and specifically on me. Years of my own body being treated as the site of the failure, when the actual explanation had been sitting, unexamined, inside her own son's cells the entire time. I didn't tell him immediately. I told myself I was protecting him from a hard truth during an already hard loss. I think, if I'm honest with myself now, some smaller and more human part of me was simply waiting to see what he would do with the information once I did share it, and some other part, quieter still, had already begun quietly building an exit. One careful brick at a time, in case the answer turned out to be nothing at all. It was around then, 3 months before I left, that I first noticed Brielle's name appearing more frequently in Grant's calendar. First as a scheduling assistant CC'd on routine correspondence, and then, gradually, as someone whose meetings with him ran later and later, whose name he mentioned with a specific, carefully neutral casualness that itself became its own kind of evidence. I didn't confront him. 11 years of practiced calm doesn't dismantle itself overnight, even once you've started to suspect the thing it's been protecting isn't worth protecting anymore. I simply started paying closer attention, the way you do once you've finally stopped assuming good faith by default, and within 6 weeks I had learned everything I needed to know, including the detail about the bracelet, which by then had stopped surprising me and had simply confirmed something I'd already, quietly, decided. By the time Grant asked for the divorce, framed, of course, as something Brielle's pregnancy had made unavoidable, rather than something his own conduct had made inevitable. I had already spoken to Priya twice, already had a rough sense of what a fair settlement should look like given 11 years of unpaid domestic labor and a career I'd been walked out of at 26, and already knew, with a clarity that surprised even me, that I wasn't going to fight to keep a marriage that had spent a decade quietly making clear it didn't particularly want to keep me either. The $15 million, when it was finally negotiated, felt less like a windfall and more like severance pay for a job I should have quit years earlier, if anyone had ever told me quitting was allowed. In that half-sleep, my mind kept replaying scenes on a loop. Grant's hand, faintly unsteady, sliding the folder with the settlement across the granite kitchen island. Brielle's shape behind the hydrangeas, one palm pressed low on her back. Diane's voice on the phone, sharp as a paper cut. "Is this really about $15 million, Vivian? You could have just tolerated a few things. The particular cold of the metal armrest in the hospital corridor at Greenwich Fertility. My knuckles white around a lab report I didn't understand yet, but already knew was bad news. And the bracelet. The day we signed the papers at the lawyer's office, Brielle had been wearing a thin gold bracelet with a single sapphire charm, the one Grant had given me for our 9th anniversary. I'd found it too delicate for my taste, and had left it in a drawer for 2 years. I never asked how it ended up on her wrist. When I finally did ask, months earlier, before any of this, Grant had said, "Oh, I think Mom borrowed it for a charity auction and forgot to give it back." Ask her. I had believed him. I had actually believed him. Looking back, it's almost funny how stupid that was. But at the time, I believed him completely. Not because he was a particularly good liar, but because I was still working so hard at being the kind of wife who didn't ask questions like that. A good wife doesn't accuse her husband of handing her jewelry to another woman. That would be petty. Beneath her. And it was exactly that kind of beneath her that had been quietly suffocating me for years. The signing itself had happened 3 days earlier, in a conference room on the 31st floor of Priya's firm, all glass and pale wood, and the specific hush of a room built for transactions large enough to require silence rather than conversation. Grant's attorney, a heavy-set man named Feldman, who'd handled the Whitlock family's business for 2 decades, had slid the settlement folder across the table with the same practiced neutrality he probably brought to any contract, regardless of what it happened to be ending. I remember Grant's hand, holding his pen, trembling very slightly as he signed his own signature onto the final page, a tremor I'd never once seen from him in 11 years of watching him sign contracts worth vastly more consequence than this one. I remember thinking, watching it, that it was the closest he'd come to showing me actual feeling since the day we married, and that it had taken losing me entirely to produce it. 15 million, Feldman had said, sliding a second document across for my own signature, structured as a lump sum transfer within 5 business days of execution, in full and final settlement of all marital claims, per the terms outlined in Section 4. He'd said it the way a man announces a flight departure time, a fact with no emotional content attached, though the number itself represented, in its own blunt way, 11 years distilled down to a figure a lawyer could type into a template without blinking. I signed without reading every clause twice, which surprised Priya, who'd spent the better part of a week preparing me to negotiate harder on several points I ultimately let go without a fight. I didn't want a longer negotiation. I wanted the exit, cleanly, as fast as it could legally be arranged, and I had learned enough, over 11 years, to know precisely which battles were worth the additional months they'd cost me, and which ones simply weren't. Priya walked me to the elevator afterward, uncharacteristically quiet for a woman who rarely let a silence sit unfilled for long. "You could have gotten more," she said, once the elevator doors closed. "The equity stake alone," If you'd pushed. I know. You don't seem like you care that you left money on the table. I don't, I said and meant it, watching the floor numbers count down. I spent 11 years being evaluated on a spreadsheet, Priya. Usefulness, presentability, whether I could produce an heir. I'm not interested in spending one more month negotiating my own worth down to a number, even a generous one. I want the exit. The rest is just arithmetic. She'd hugged me tightly in the lobby, longer than either of us usually allowed ourselves in public, and told me she was proud of me, a sentence nobody in the Whitlock family had ever once said to me in 11 years, for anything. We're here. The car had stopped in front of a pale ochre building in Trastevere, ivy climbing one side of it, wrought iron balconies with laundry strung between them even in November. Streetlight fell through a fig tree and threw moving shadows across the cobblestones. It was beautiful in the particular, careless way only very old cities manage without trying. Matteo carried my suitcase up 3 flights and led us into a small one-bedroom apartment with warped wood floors that creaked pleasantly underfoot. The kitchen already had milk, eggs, bread, a jar of good olive oil. The refrigerator held fresh vegetables and a bag of blood oranges. Through the living room window I could see a shuttered bakery and a flower stall, both dark, both still glowing faintly with the last bit of streetlight caught in their windows. Water heater switch is on the wall in the bathroom, left side. Give it 10 minutes before you shower. He set my suitcase by the bedroom door and turned to face me. Anything else you need? Just call. Matteo. I leaned against the doorframe. You're being unreasonably good to me. Aren't you worried I'll get used to it? He paused, then laughed, a short, surprised sound. Please do. I've been waiting 16 years for that particular problem. The words were half a joke and half not, and I didn't have an answer ready, so the silence stretched a few seconds too long before he cleared his throat, gave me a few more instructions about the boiler and the recycling schedule, and set a spare key on the entryway table. In case, he said, without elaborating on in case of what. After he left, the apartment was very quiet. I stood in the middle of the living room and looked around at the unfamiliar ceiling, the unfamiliar smell of someone else's idea of home, the small patch of amber streetlight lying across the floorboards. I unpacked slowly. I hadn't brought much. In the bathroom mirror, I looked exactly as bad as I felt. My collarbones stood out sharply. My eyes had gone hollow at the edges. I ran cold water and splashed my face until the shock of it cleared my head a little. When I finally turned my phone back on in bed, it lit up like a slot machine. 31 missed calls from Grant, 9 from Diane, a dozen texts from Priya, my lawyer, and, before any of this, my closest friend from law school, who Grant's firm had specifically not been able to intimidate into silence. The last one read, "After you sent that message, Grant locked himself in his office for 3 hours. Brielle knocked and he wouldn't let her in. What did you tell him?" I didn't answer her yet. I scrolled up through Grant's texts instead. They got longer and more frantic the further back I went. What do you mean the transfer worked? What do you mean it was mine? Why didn't you tell me? Then, Viv, please pick up. We can fix this. Then, I'm not signing anything else. Come home. We don't have to do this. You can keep the money and the house and everything. Just come home. And finally, at 1:14 in the morning, Viv. I can't breathe. I looked at those 3 words for a long time. Couldn't breathe. Grant, do you have any idea what breathing felt like for me during the injections? My stomach a map of yellow and purple bruises, my hands shaking so badly some mornings that I had to sit on the bathroom floor and steady the needle with both hands. Do you know what it felt like coming out of anesthesia after the retrieval? So sick I couldn't sit up. A nurse asking, "Is there someone we should call?" And me saying, "Not really?" Do you know what it felt like in June, sitting in that corridor while a woman walked past holding a newborn who let out one small cry. And I just started crying too and couldn't stop for the better part of an hour, and not one single person noticed? You don't know. You never wanted to know. I set the phone face down on the nightstand and rolled over. Somewhere outside, a church bell was tolling, slow and unhurried. 1, 2, 3. I closed my eyes and felt 2 tears slide sideways into my ears, cold as the water in the bathroom sink. By the second week, I had started going outside. I woke without an alarm, toasted bread, made coffee, and sat at the window watching the street wake up below me. The bakery owner, a heavy-set woman with flour permanently dusted into the creases of her apron, rolled up the metal shutter every morning at 7 and arranged loaves in the window like she was setting a table. The florist, an older man who always wore the same green cardigan regardless of temperature, changed the water in his buckets of ranunculus and ended up talking to at least 3 passers-by before he'd finished. A delivery boy on a battered bicycle rattled over the cobblestones every morning around 8, humming something off-key. These small, unremarkable scenes worked on me like a sedative. Slowly, without my quite noticing it happening, they pulled me out of the wreckage of the last several months. Matteo came by nearly every evening after work. Sometimes he brought fruit. Sometimes a book he thought I'd like. Sometimes nothing at all. He'd just sit on the couch for half an hour, drink a cup of tea, and leave. He never once asked if I was okay. He seemed to understand, without being told, that it was an impossible question to answer honestly. Instead, he talked about his projects. His firm had just taken on the restoration of a 17th-century palazzo whose elderly owner refused to let anyone touch the frescoed ceilings, but wanted the whole building rewired for modern heating. "So how do you run electrical through a building you're not allowed to open up?" I asked one evening, while he peeled an apple for me in one long, unbroken spiral, the way he always had, even in college. "Still working on it," he said, handing me the peeled apple. "But I like a client like that. She has convictions. Most people don't." "So you're complimenting her." "And you, a little," he said, not looking up from the apple core. "You had convictions too. You just spent 11 years pretending you didn't have any, for the sake of peace." I didn't answer that. I ate the apple instead. It was tart in a way that woke something up in the back of my jaw. I met Matteo Conti in the rain, in the fall of 2008, outside the architecture building on a campus in upstate New York, both of us barely 20. I was a freshman, newly arrived, my whole life packed into 2 suitcases and a duffel bag that smelled like my mother's cedar closet. He was a third-year graduate student, Roman by birth, raised partly in Boston after his father took a teaching post there, fluent in both places and fully at home in neither. I was standing under the building's overhang because I'd missed the shuttle to my dorm and didn't yet understand the bus system, and he came out with a folder of drawings under one arm and asked if I needed help. I said no, out of the particular pride of an 18-year-old determined not to seem lost on her first week anywhere. So he just stood there with me and waited for the rain to ease up, and we talked about nothing. The ugliness of the new dining hall, whether Rome or New York had worse traffic. What he was going to do with a graduate degree in a field where half the interesting jobs required knowing someone's uncle. I don't remember most of what we said. I remember that his voice was low and unhurried in a way that made the rain feel less urgent. There is a photograph from that same semester, taken at a welcome mixer for the architecture department, that I didn't know existed until years later. In it, I'm wearing an oversized sweatshirt, laughing at something out of frame, and Matteo is standing slightly behind me with his hands in his pockets, his head tilted, looking at me with an expression I would not have been able to read at 18, and can read perfectly well now. We were close for 2 years in the specific, intense way that only happens in college. Study sessions that ran until 3 in the morning, A road trip to Montreal we couldn't afford. Him teaching me to make a proper carbonara in the cramped kitchen of his off-campus apartment while I burned the first 3 attempts. And then, in my junior year, I met Grant Whitlock at a fundraising gala my roommate dragged me to, and Grant was 29 and already running his father's development company, and looked at me like I was the only interesting object in a room full of people trying to be interesting. Matteo finished his degree that spring and went home to Rome to apprentice with a restoration firm. We wrote for a while, long emails, then shorter ones, then a Christmas card, then nothing. The way these things go when one person has started planning a wedding. He came to that wedding, actually. I found out later that he'd flown in from Rome and back within 36 hours, and that he'd told people it was for a work conference in Manhattan that happened to overlap. I remember him at the reception in a gray suit, shaking Grant's hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and then leaving before the cake was cut. I didn't think much of it at the time. I had a lot of other things to think about. Over the years there were visits, a conference of his in Chicago, a work trip of mine to Milan that I extended by 2 days without telling Grant exactly why, a handful of dinners whenever our paths crossed, always framed, carefully, as 2 old friends catching up. I told myself that's all it was. I think some part of me needed it to be all it was, because the alternative would have required admitting things about my marriage I wasn't ready to admit yet. He never once, in 16 years, said anything that would have forced the issue. Grant's texts kept arriving in decreasing but steady waves. Fewer calls, more long messages sent late at night, when a person's guard tends to drop. One, a week in, included a photograph of the study at the house on Larkspur Lane, and the lilac bush visible through the window, with the caption, "Came back to the house today. Smells like you everywhere." I didn't answer, but I read every one, not out of tenderness, out of a kind of clinical curiosity about how far a person's regret could stretch once it had nowhere useful to go. I'd found a small cafe near the river and ordered a cappuccino, tired from a morning of wandering, when my phone buzzed again. This time it was Priya. "Vivian, is now an okay time? There's something I need to tell you." "What happened?" "Diane showed up at the office this morning and made a scene," Priya wrote. "Somehow she found out about the text you sent Grant, about the pregnancy, about the fragmentation results. She lost it in the reception area. Started shouting at Brielle, called her cursed, said she'd already gotten one of the Whitlock grandchildren killed, and now she was probably going to lose these 2 as well." Brielle burst into tears. Grant tried to get his mother to stop, and Diane turned on him too, called him spineless for trading a proper wife for, and I'm quoting her exactly, "some homewrecker who can't even hold a pregnancy right." My hand paused around the coffee cup. "What else did she say?" "She said," Priya wrote, then paused for a long beat before the next message came through. "She said she's coming to find you. To get you to come back. She said the 15 million can't just be given away for nothing. Either you come back and stay married to him, or you give it back." She said this in the middle of the office, loud enough for the floor below to hear it through the elevator shaft. I laughed out loud, a short, startled, genuinely disbelieving sound. He truly hadn't changed at all. "What are you going to do?" Priya asked. "She says she's booking a flight to Rome." "Let her come," I typed back, setting my cup down with a small, definite click against the saucer. Rome is a big city. If she wants to find me, she's welcome to try. And if she manages it, I've got a few things I'd like to say to her too. After I put the phone down, I sat in the wicker chair and watched a tour boat move slowly down the river, tourists waving at people on the bank, someone laughing too loudly at their own joke. A cold wind came off the water and I pulled Matteo's scarf, which I still hadn't returned, a little tighter around my throat. Diane, coming all the way to Rome. My former mother-in-law, whom I had served in one form or another for 11 years, had suddenly rediscovered my virtues the moment she'd realized the replacement model had defects of her own. Not because she'd ever actually thought well of me, because she'd just discovered that the 26-year-old couldn't tolerate her temper, couldn't manage her particular brand of relentless dissatisfaction, couldn't clear the bar that kept quietly rising the moment anyone got close to it. Brielle probably thought a twin pregnancy was a golden ticket. She had no idea who she was dealing with. Diane evaluated daughters-in-law the way some people evaluate furniture. Is it useful? Is it presentable? Does it reflect well on the family name? Can it produce a male heir? And the standards were never fixed. They simply rose, forever, no matter what you handed her. Give her a grandson and she'll complain your family didn't have money. Bring money and she'll complain you don't visit enough. Visit constantly and she'll find some new failing to hold against you. And Grant, her good, obedient son, what was his instinct whenever real pressure arrived? Lock himself in an office, text his ex-wife that he couldn't breathe. Let two women fight it out in a lobby while he hid behind a closed door. He had always been exactly this. When his mother had humiliated me at that dinner table years ago, hadn't he done precisely the same thing? Gone quiet? Kept eating? Let it happen? I finished my coffee, left a tip, and on the walk home stopped at the flower stall and bought a small bundle of white ranunculus. The florist wrapped them in brown paper and said something in Italian I didn't catch. He repeated it slowly, in broken English. New life, yes? I thought about that for a second, then nodded. Yes. New life. When I reached my building, Matteo was standing at the entrance holding 2 grocery bags. Found a whole branzino, he said, lifting one of the bags. Had to hit 2 different markets. We're steaming it tonight. I held up the ranunculus so he could see them. He grinned. You bring flowers, I bring fish. Between the two of us, that's basically a life. As we climbed the stairs, I turned back toward him. Matteo, what do I do if Diane actually shows up here? He thought about it for a moment. You don't have to say anything at all. Let her talk. Once she's finished saying whatever she came to say, stand up and walk away. That's the whole plan? That's the whole plan. He came up beside me and looked down at me on the step below. Vivian, you don't owe the Whitlocks anything else. 11 years, $15 million, and a child you never even got to meet. You don't owe them another minute. The only person you owe a good life to is yourself. He didn't wait for an answer. He carried the fish into the kitchen, and I stood in the entryway holding the ranunculus for a long time before I followed him in. Diane arrived on a Saturday morning. Matteo knocked on my door earlier than usual, dressed more carefully than his habit. Dark jeans, a charcoal sweater, an expression that had lost its usual ease. She's here. I was getting coffee and saw a taxi pull up out front. Older woman in a camel coat, taking pictures of the building with her phone. Camel coat. That was Diane's signature, the coat she always described, unprompted, as having cost more than most people's cars. Do you want me to come down with you? No. I stood and pulled my hair back into a low knot. This one's mine. Then I'll be at the cafe across the street, he said, in a tone that left no real room to argue. Wave when you're done. I found her standing on the opposite side of the street, phone raised, photographing the building's facade like a tourist. She was indeed in the camel coat, paired with tall black boots, her hair freshly colored a shade of chestnut that looked more expensive than natural. If you didn't know her, you'd have taken her for an elegant woman in early retirement, comfortably wealthy, entirely at ease. She spotted me, lowered the phone, and smiled. A complicated expression, part performance, part genuine discomfort. The look of someone forced to be gracious toward a person she'd spent over a decade quietly looking down on. Vivian. She crossed the street in small, hurried steps, both hands out to take mine. How could you just disappear like that? I've been worried sick. I stepped back, just out of reach. Diane, I'm not your daughter-in-law anymore. Vivian's fine. Her hands froze mid-air. The smile stayed on her face for another second or two, like a photograph someone forgot to update, and then she recovered. Still angry, I see, she said, arranging her features into something warm and maternal. Let's sit somewhere and talk. Is there a cafe near here? I pointed behind me. That one, by the river. I picked the outdoor tables on purpose. Late November in Rome is cold enough that no reasonable person lingers outside for long, and I had no intention of spending my whole morning on this. We sat at a small metal table by the water. A waiter came for our order. I asked for a black coffee. Diane asked for tea, then muttered to me, not quite under her breath. Tell him to use real leaves, not a bag. These people never understand tea properly. The waiter looked politely lost. I translated the request. He shrugged and walked off. Terrible service here, Diane sniffed. I didn't respond, watching the river and waiting for her to get to the point. She wrapped both hands around her teacup once it arrived, gathering herself. Vivian, I came because I want you to consider coming back. Her eyes stayed lowered, not quite meeting mine. Grant was foolish. Bewitched by some little schemer, that's all this was. I've scolded him plenty. He regrets it, he's barely eating, he's lost weight. Diane, I cut in, does any of that have anything to do with me? She looked up, a flash of irritation crossing her face before she smoothed it away. Of course it does. You're his lawfully wedded wife. 11 years of marriage and you're just going to throw all of it away? Wife. I repeated the word slowly, turning it over. Diane, I remember you telling me on the phone 6 months ago that if I signed the papers quietly, the family would settle a fair amount on me, and that would be the end of it. I signed. I received the money. Why are you suddenly unhappy with that arrangement? Her expression shifted, her mouth tightening into a thin line. That was before. This is now. She set her cup down with a clatter. At the time, I didn't know you were even capable of carrying a pregnancy. Whether I was capable or not, you were always so certain you knew better than the doctors, weren't you? I held her gaze. When the clinic told us it was Grant's numbers that were the problem, your first instinct wasn't to get your son treated. It was to call me a hen who couldn't lay an egg. Have you managed to forget that already? That was said in anger. In anger? I let out a short laugh, not particularly bitter, more knowing than anything. You said it in anger in front of your entire bridge club. You said it in anger at the country club, to your friends. You said it in anger at every single holiday table for 6 straight years, Diane. Doesn't it exhaust you, being angry that consistently? Her face fell apart a little, the practiced warmth draining out of it. She clearly hadn't expected the formerly compliant, never-talks-back daughter-in-law to lay all of this out so plainly over coffee, in a foreign city she'd had to fly across an ocean to reach. After a beat of silence, she tried a different tactic, softening her voice, reaching for my hand. I moved it away before she could take it. Vivian, I know you feel wronged. I was unfair to you before, I'll admit that much. But things are different now. That Brielle, you think she's some innocent? A fresh hire who ended up in Grant's bed within months of starting the job. What kind of person does that? Whether she's decent or not was your son's decision to make, not mine. Don't say that. Diane's voice climbed, agitated now. You don't know the half of it. She's showing her real colors. Every day it's more money, more property, a bigger share of the company. She complains about the cooking, complains the housekeeper's too slow, and she hasn't even moved in yet, and she's already trying to run the house. 7 months along, and instead of resting, She's out getting facials and shopping. The doctors told her the cord is wrapped around one of the baby's necks, and she needs strict bed rest, and she says she's bored sitting at home. Is that any way to behave? I picked up my coffee and drank without answering. Seeing that I wasn't taking the bait, she pressed harder. Vivian, think about it seriously. What happens if something goes wrong with those babies? The doctor already said twins are high risk on their own, and a cord wrapped twice is not a small thing. If something happens to them, what becomes of Grant? What becomes of this family? My hand, holding the cup, went still for a second. So you came all this way, I said. Because you're worried Brielle's pregnancy might fail, and you'd like a backup heir on standby. I said the words backup heir quietly, but every syllable landed exactly where I wanted it to. Diane's face drained of color. That's not what I meant. That's exactly what you meant. I set my cup down. Diane, let me be straightforward with you, since you've flown all this way. My chances of conceiving again, even with treatment, are very low. My numbers were never good to begin with, and everything since has only made that worse. Even if I wanted to go back, which I don't, I likely couldn't give the Whitlocks a child at all. Her mouth opened, but nothing came out. And one more thing, I said, standing and pulling my coat off the back of the chair. Everything you just said about Brielle, you said almost word for word about me, 7 years ago. Except back then it was, her family's in decline. She's not good enough for our Grant. Diane, do you honestly think swapping out one daughter-in-law for the next changes anything, when the problem was never the daughter-in-law? She stared at me, lips parted. Whatever composure she'd arrived with fully collapsed. I turned to leave, then, after a few steps, turned back. She was slumped in the wicker chair, the camel coat suddenly looking absurd wrapped around her, like a costume for a role she could no longer play convincingly. One more thing, Diane. Grant's been sending me quite a lot of messages. One of them mentioned the twins' latest scan, the cord situation, and the doctor's concern about developmental delay. If you've really got the time to spend chasing me around Rome, you might be better off flying home and sitting in on those appointments yourself. After all, that's supposedly the future of your family. Her face went genuinely gray. The teacup slipped from her hand and shattered on the pavement. The waiter came running. I said, "Mi dispiace" in Italian, told him to put it on my bill, and crossed the street. Matteo had seen me coming and was already on his feet, pushing the cafe door open to meet me. He took one look at my face and asked nothing, just handed me the latte he'd been keeping warm in his own hands. "Is it still hot?" "It's fine," he said, smiling faintly. "Your hands are freezing, though." I didn't answer, wrapping both palms around the cup and letting the warmth work its way in slowly. We walked along the river together, the plane trees stripped bare, their branches drawing sharp black lines against a gray sky. After a few minutes, he finally asked, "Did you say everything you needed to?" She said Brielle's no good and I should come back. I told her my body probably can't have children anymore, so she should let go of that particular hope. He was quiet for a moment. "Vivian." His voice had gone soft. "You don't need to prove your worth by whether or not you can have a child. You never did." I didn't answer, pulling my scarf higher to hide the sudden sting behind my eyes. Across the river, the dome of a church I still didn't know the name of sat pale against the clouds, scaffolding wrapped around one side of it where restoration work had clearly been going on for years. I remembered reading once that restoring something that old is harder than building new, because you can't just tear it down and start again. You have to work carefully, piece by piece, on top of what's already broken. I suppose people work the same way. Diane stayed in Rome for 3 more days. She called 7 times. I didn't answer once. Eventually, Grant had to call her back. Brielle had had a frightening episode of abdominal pain late one night and been rushed to the hospital, And though they'd managed to stabilize things, the doctor had made it clear that without strict bed rest, the risk of an early delivery was serious. When Priya relayed this to me, her tone carried an odd note of sympathy. Honestly, Vivian, I don't think she was faking any of it. She's 26, first pregnancy, twins. Her body genuinely can't handle the stress. And apparently, after Diane got back, her whole attitude softened. I think whatever you said in Rome actually landed. I didn't comment beyond saying I hoped the babies would be all right. I meant it. I didn't like Brielle. I might even say some part of me resented her. But the children hadn't done anything. I had been in Rome almost a month when Matteo asked me, over coffee at his kitchen table on a lazy Sunday, what my plans were. The question caught me off guard. My days, up to that point, had been filled with walking, reading, cooking badly, and staring out windows. A genuinely luxurious kind of idleness. With $15 million sitting in an account, the interest alone could have funded several quiet lifetimes. But I had never once, in 34 years, been someone who could sit still for long. I want to open a studio, I heard myself say. Matteo raised an eyebrow over his cup. Interior design? Small. 2 or 3 people to start. I turned my cup slowly on its saucer. I did residential and boutique retail design back home for years before it got harder to justify a full-time job on top of everything else. Since I've been here, I keep looking at these old buildings and getting ideas I want to try. The design language is different here. There's more comfort with negative space. Nobody feels the need to fill every square foot. Back home, clients always told me my proposals felt too empty. I went on, warming to it in a way that surprised me. Like if they were spending that much money, every surface needed to justify itself. But rooms need room to breathe. So do people. Matteo watched me with a slow, deepening smile. What? You're coming back to life, he said, setting his cup down. The night I picked you up at the airport, you sat in that passenger seat like something that had been left out in a frost. It's different now. How's it different? There's light in your eyes again. I looked down and drank my coffee to hide the color rising in my face. That afternoon, he let me flip through the project archive in his study. Decades of restoration work, private residences, a public library, sketches in a hand so precise and confident it was practically its own kind of signature. Tucked into one folder, a photograph slipped loose and fell to the floor. I bent to pick it up and stopped cold. It was the picture from that welcome mixer, autumn of 2008. Both of us barely 20, me in an oversized sweatshirt on the steps of the architecture building, laughing at something out of frame, Matteo beside me with his hands in his pockets, and his head tilted toward me in a way I had never noticed until just now. Why do you have this? I held it up. He looked over from his stack of blueprints, his expression stiffening for a half second before smoothing back into neutrality. I've kept it the whole time. 16 years. 16 years? You were a freshman. I was in my 3rd year. It was taken the night we met, actually. Someone from the department must have snapped it and given copies out later. You probably don't remember. I remember the rain. I remember everything, he said simply, taking the photo from my hand, looking at it for a long moment and handing it back. You'd just gotten to campus. You looked like a little sun that hadn't figured out yet how bright it was. Matteo. I looked up at him, and the rest of the sentence caught somewhere behind my teeth. Some questions don't get asked at 20. It turns out they don't get any easier at 34. Is it too late to ask now? I finally managed. He seemed to already know what I meant to say, because he only smiled, faint and a little sad, and turned back to his desk. Some things don't need saying out loud. Seeing you happy again is enough for me. He said it lightly, tossing it over his shoulder like it cost him nothing, and went back to his drawings. I slid the photograph carefully back into its folder. That night, back in my own apartment, I lay awake a long time, my head full of overlapping images. Rain on a New York campus, the river outside my window, Grant's face the day he'd slid that settlement across the counter, Mateo's deliberate, careful indifference. A little after 1 in the morning, my phone buzzed. I assumed it was another late-night message from Grant and almost silenced it without looking. Then I saw the name on the screen and my finger froze over the button. Brielle. I hesitated a few seconds before answering. Silence on the other end at first, then a young woman's voice, cracked and exhausted, nothing at all like the careful, faintly triumphant tone she'd had months ago at the lawyer's office. Vivian, I'm sorry to call so late. What is it? Another pause. I could hear her steady herself before she spoke again. I wanted to ask you something. When you were doing the treatments, did it hurt? My grip on the phone tightened. Yes, I said. The injections left my stomach covered in bruises for weeks. The retrieval hurt badly enough that I threw up when the anesthesia wore off. After a transfer, you have to lie flat for hours, and you need help just getting to the bathroom. It hurt from beginning to end, every step of it. On the other end, she made a small broken sound. The doctor said, he said I might lose one of them. Her voice cracked entirely. The cords wrapped around his neck twice. He's not growing the way he should be, and my fluid's low. If it gets worse, they'll have to do an emergency section. I'm not even 27, Vivian. I'm so scared. I sat back against my headboard. Outside, the Roman night was deep and quiet, an ambulance siren rising and fading somewhere in the distance. Brielle. I said her name evenly, without any edge to it. Right now, what you need to do is not be scared. You need to listen to your doctor. If he says bed rest, then it's bed rest, full stop. Twins are riskier than a single pregnancy under the best circumstances, and you have no control over how the cord sits. Taking care of yourself right now is the only responsible thing you can do for either of them. She went quiet for a long stretch. You don't hate me? The question was so careful, so much like a child bracing for a scolding, that something in me softened despite myself. Hate you? I let out a short laugh, not unkind, more genuinely bewildered by the question. Brielle, what exactly do you think you took from me? A good husband? A good marriage? If that's really what you believe, you understand Grant even less than I did after 11 years. Silence, just her breathing. He's not a cruel man, I went on. He's a man with no spine. When his mother tore into me, he said nothing. When I lost that pregnancy, he was on a business trip and didn't call. When I had a minor surgery 2 years ago, he had his assistant sign the consent forms because he couldn't be bothered to leave a meeting. Do you really think building a life with someone like that is a prize? You climbed onto the same broken-down bus right after I got off it. You thought you were getting an upgrade. The frame was already rusted through before you ever got on. I paused. So no, I don't hate you. I just feel sorry for you. She started crying then, not loudly, just quiet, ragged sobs, like something small licking its wounds in a corner. I stayed on the line without speaking, listening to her cry, to a monitor beeping somewhere behind her. She was clearly still at the hospital. Vivian, she said eventually, once she'd cried herself out, her voice barely above a whisper. If the baby doesn't make it, will he leave me too? The way he left you? I closed my eyes. This, finally, was the real reason for the call. Brielle, listen to me carefully. I kept my voice gentle but firm. Whether the pregnancy goes well or not, whatever Grant decides to do down the line, there's one thing you need to hold on to. You are yourself first, before you're anyone's wife or anyone's mother. Don't hang the entirety of your worth on another person, because people change and promises expire. Those children will be yours no matter what happens with him. But your life was never supposed to be only about them or only about him. Figure out who you are without either of those things attached to you. That's the only insurance policy that actually holds up. She was quiet, and then, very softly, I don't know how to do that. Neither did I, a month ago, I said. You start by getting through tonight. Then tomorrow. It adds up slower than you'd think, but it adds up. We didn't say much else. Before we hung up, she said, almost inaudibly, "Thank you for talking to me." I told her to get some rest and meant it, and set the phone down in the dark, feeling something I hadn't expected. Not forgiveness exactly, but something adjacent to it. A door that had been slammed shut easing open by an inch. The twins arrived 7 weeks early, in the middle of a Tuesday night, delivered by emergency cesarean after the smaller one's heart rate dropped during a routine monitoring appointment. Priya sent me the news the next morning, along with the detail that Grant had apparently fainted in the hallway outside the operating room and had to be revived by his own mother, which struck me as, on balance, exactly the kind of story that family deserved to have follow it around for years. Both boys spent 5 weeks in the neonatal unit. Grant's texts during that stretch grew quieter, less frantic, more like the messages of a man who had run out of adrenaline and was left only with the plain facts of what he'd built and broken. One night he wrote, "They're both breathing on their own now. Smaller one still has a feeding tube. I don't know how to be a father to 2 kids who almost died because of decisions I made before they existed." I didn't answer that one for 2 days. When I finally did, all I wrote was, "Then learn quickly. They don't have the luxury of waiting for you to figure it out." He wrote back, "I know. I'm trying." I didn't have a response for that, so I didn't send one. A week before Christmas, Mateo cooked dinner at his apartment. Sea bass. Always sea bass, steamed simply with lemon and oil, because he'd once watched me choke on a fish bone at a college dinner 16 years earlier and had apparently never forgotten it. "Why do you always make this exact fish?" I asked, picking a piece apart with my fork. "Because you like it. And it's got almost no small bones, so you won't end up back in an emergency room the way you did sophomore year." "How do you even remember that?" "You tried swallowing bread to force it down. Didn't work. Had to go get it removed at 2 in the morning. I happened to be there," he said, not looking up, focused on deboning a piece from my plate with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. 16 years, and I still remember exactly which fish did it. Branzino. Same as this. I sat with that a moment. "You have an unreasonably good memory." "I remember people who've wronged me for the rest of my life," he said, setting the deboned piece in my bowl. "And people I care about, I remember for twice that long apparently, since I'm still doing it." I put my fork down. "Mateo. Give me some time. I'm not saying no. I just need to get my own life sorted out first. The studio's not even real yet, it's a name and an idea. I need to know I can build something on my own before I let myself lean on anyone else building something next to me. I don't want to be someone who just drifts from one man's orbit into another's." He looked at me for a long moment, something quiet and steady moving behind his eyes. "How long?" he asked. "I don't know. 6 months, maybe. Maybe a year." "Okay," he said, without a beat of hesitation, going back to the fish like he hadn't just agreed to something enormous. "Then I'll wait 6 months. If 6 isn't enough, a year. If a year isn't enough, 2. I've already waited 16. What's another year or 2 on top of that?" Something in my chest that had been braced for a fight, or worse, for the particular disappointment men so often turn into a debt you're expected to repay, simply loosened instead. It didn't collapse. It was, for the first time in longer than I could remember, caught gently, and held. Christmas that year fell 9 days after I'd asked Mateo to wait, and I spent most of the morning of it fully expecting to feel the particular hollowness that had followed me through every previous December of my adult life, the one that arrived, reliably, whenever the Whitlock family's holiday performances demanded the most from me and returned the least. Instead, Mateo showed up at 9 in the morning with a box of pastries from Ettore's shop, which had opened specially for 2 hours purely to accommodate the neighborhood's holiday orders, and announced that Lucia had instructed him, in terms he described as non-negotiable, to bring me to lunch whether or not I felt ready for an actual family production. "I don't want to intrude on your family's Christmas," I said, which was true. And also, underneath it, the much older and more specific fear of showing up somewhere I hadn't been fully invited and discovering, mid-meal, that I'd misread the invitation. "She sent an actual written menu," Mateo said, holding up his phone as evidence. "3 courses, plus what she's calling a 4th course that's technically just more dessert. There is no version of this where you not attending makes anyone's Christmas better. It just makes mine worse, specifically." Lucia's apartment, when we arrived, smelled like rosemary and roasting lamb and the specific sweetness of panettone, and she greeted me at the door with both hands on my face, the way I imagined she'd have greeted a daughter home from a long absence before I'd even gotten my coat off. "You look thinner than the photographs," she announced, which turned out to be Lucia's version of nearly every greeting, delivered with enough warmth that it never once landed as an insult. "Sit. Eat. Mateo, pour the wine, don't make her ask twice." It was, that afternoon, the first Christmas in longer than I could clearly remember where nobody at the table evaluated my worth against a checklist, where nobody's toast contained a barbed aside about grandchildren not yet arrived, where the entire event simply consisted of good food, unhurried conversation, and Lucia's determined campaign to feed me a second helping of everything regardless of my protests. At one point, clearing plates between courses, she paused behind my chair and rested a hand briefly on my shoulder, the way you'd touch someone you'd already, silently, decided to keep. "He's been alone a long time," she said quietly, just to me, while Mateo argued in the kitchen with his uncle about whether the wine needed to breathe longer. "Not lonely, exactly. He's good at filling a life with work and keeping busy. But alone. I used to worry, honestly, that he'd simply decided this was going to be the whole shape of things. I'm glad I was wrong." I didn't have a ready answer for that, so I simply covered her hand with mine for a moment, and she seemed to accept that as sufficient, and went back to the kitchen to referee the wine debate. We called my mother that evening from Mateo's apartment, propping the phone against a stack of books so both of us could fit in the frame. She was 3 time zones behind, mid-afternoon in Florida, sitting on her screened porch with a glass of the sweet iced tea she'd been making the same way for 40 years. "Well," she said, taking us both in, "you look happy. Both of you. That's not nothing, you know. I've seen plenty of Christmas video calls in my life that looked like hostage footage. Mom, I'm simply making an observation." She sipped her tea, unbothered. "Mateo, has she told you about the year she insisted on carving the turkey herself because your father wasn't doing it fast enough, and nearly took off her own thumb?" "She is not," Mateo said, delighted, settling in like a man who fully intended to extract every last detail of this story before the call ended. "Mom, you don't have to." "She was 14, my mother continued, entirely ignoring me, and so determined to prove she could do something better than the way it had always been done, that she nearly needed stitches over a turkey. I've always thought that told you most of what you needed to know about her, honestly. Give her something everyone else assumes only one way of doing, and she'll find a better way, even if it costs her a little blood to get there." "That's a remarkably generous read of a childhood injury," I said. "I'm your mother. I'm allowed the generous read. She raised her glass slightly toward the camera, a small private toast. Merry Christmas, both of you. Try not to nearly lose a thumb over anything this year. Once per lifetime is plenty. After we hung up, Mateo sat back against the couch cushions, still smiling faintly at the turkey story, and pulled me against his side in the unhurried way that had become, over the past weeks, entirely ordinary between us, entirely without agenda beyond simply wanting to be near each other. Your mother likes me, he said. My mother has liked you since before I ever properly introduced you. She had a sign made, Mateo. Handwritten. That's not a that would have seemed impossible to imagine, standing on a flagstone path in Connecticut just 7 weeks earlier, dragging a suitcase toward a car that was finally, entirely mine to drive wherever I chose. Registering a business in Italy as a foreigner turns out to be its own kind of endurance test, one that made the entire IVF process look almost efficient by comparison. I spent the better part of 3 weeks moving between a commercialista's cramped office near the Pantheon and the Chamber of Commerce, filling out forms in a language I was still only half fluent in, while a patient woman named Simona, who Mateo's firm had recommended, walked me through the difference between a partita IVA and the various flavors of small business structure available to me. You could just hire an Italian lawyer to make this disappear, Mateo said one evening, watching me color-code a stack of paperwork at his kitchen table. I want to understand it myself, I said. I spent 11 years signing whatever was put in front of me because someone told me it was handled. I'm done doing that. He didn't argue with that. He just refilled my wine glass and went back to his own drawings, and something about the ease of that, no commentary, no unsolicited advice, just quiet company while I did something hard, made the paperwork feel almost bearable. By January, I had a registered studio, a name, Cerchio, the Italian word for circle, because I liked the idea of building things that came back around to where they started, only better. And a 500-square-foot space in Monte with peeling plaster walls and a skylight that leaked when it rained, which I fully intended to fix myself, slowly, room by room, as a kind of standing advertisement for the work I did. My first real client was almost an accident. Simona's cousin ran a small pasticceria near the studio that had been in the family for 3 generations and hadn't been touched, structurally or aesthetically, since sometime in the 70s. The owner, a wiry man named Ettore, with forearms like rope from decades of kneading dough, wanted the space modernized without losing what he called its anima, its soul. A phrase every contractor he'd approached so far had apparently used as license to gut the place entirely and install something that looked like every other coffee bar in the neighborhood. I spent 2 weeks just sitting in the shop before I drew a single line, watching how people moved through it, where the light fell in the mornings, which corners the regulars claimed as their own without ever being told to. The plan I eventually presented kept the original marble counter, cleaned and resealed rather than replaced, kept the old glass display cases but rewired the lighting inside them so the pastries didn't look embalmed under fluorescent tubes, and opened up a bricked-over window in the back that let afternoon light spill across a reading nook nobody had asked for, but that every single person who saw the mock-up immediately wanted. Ettore cried a little when he saw the finished space. I did not tell him that the reading nook was a direct descendant of every unused corner of the house on Larkspur Lane that Diane had insisted stay presentable, which in her language meant untouched, unloved, and permanently roped off like a museum exhibit nobody was allowed to enjoy. Some things you build precisely because you spent years living without them. Word moved quickly after that, the way it does in a neighborhood where everyone already knows everyone's cousin. By March, Cerchio had a second designer, a soft-spoken young woman named Alba, who'd trained in Florence and had opinions about tile grout more passionate than most people have about anything, and a part-time project manager, an ex-contractor named Dario, who mostly kept us from making promises to clients that the actual construction crews couldn't deliver on time. Somewhere in the middle of all that, a message arrived from Brielle. She'd found my professional email through, of all things, an article a design blog had written about the pasticceria renovation. She was opening a small children's clothing line under her own name, funded, unsurprisingly, by Grant, and wanted to know if I would consider designing her flagship store. I sat with that request for 2 full days before answering. It wasn't forgiveness. I want to be clear with myself about that, even now. It was something closer to professionalism. The recognition that turning down good, paying work out of spite would have made me smaller, not her. I sent her a formal proposal through Sergio's regular intake process, the same one any client received, and made it clear from the outset that the arrangement was strictly professional. The design files were produced in Rome. The on-site construction was handled by a firm I vetted in Connecticut that had no connection to me beyond a contract. On opening day, she sent me a photograph. A charcoal gray slate storefront with a simple copper-toned nameplate, clean and understated in a way her earlier taste, from what little I'd seen of it, would never have chosen on its own. Underneath the photo, a message. Vivian. Thank you. For all of it. I wrote back 4 words. Wishing you a good life. I meant that too. More than I expected to. By the time spring properly arrived in Rome, my days had a shape to them again. The kind of shape I hadn't had since long before I ever met Grant Whitlock. Mornings at the studio, sketching and arguing gently with Alba about whether a client's request for an accent wall in greige was aesthetically defensible. Afternoons on site, arguing considerably less gently with contractors about load-bearing walls. Evenings, more often than not, with Matteo, sometimes at his place, sometimes mine, sometimes just walking, no destination, talking about everything except the 2 subjects that mattered most, which were what had happened to me and what, exactly, we were to each other now. He never pushed on either front. He asked about clients, about difficult permits, about whether Ettore's pastries had gotten better or worse since the renovation. Better, definitively, once he'd stopped trying to compete with the trendier bakery 2 streets over and leaned into what his grandmother used to make. He told me about the palazzo restoration, about the elderly clients' escalating and increasingly specific demands regarding the frescoes, about a stray cat that had adopted the job site and that his crew had, against every professional instinct, started leaving food out for. One warm evening in April, we found ourselves at the fountain near the piazza in Trastevere, one of the smaller, less photographed ones, half hidden behind a stand of overgrown jasmine that the neighborhood association had been fighting the city about trimming for years. It had recently come out from behind scaffolding after a slow, unglamorous restoration. The stone cleaned, the old bronze fixtures repatinated, water running clear through channels that had been clogged and green for as long as either of us had known the place. They did a good job, I said, watching the water catch the last of the evening light. Better than before, if you ask me, Matteo said. You'd never guess, looking at it now, that 18 months ago, half of it was black with grime, and the other half had a crack running straight through the basin. Do you think that's true of people too? I asked. That you come out the other side of something like that actually better, not just patched up? He considered the question seriously, the way he considered everything, and didn't answer right away. I think it depends whether anyone bothered to do the work carefully, he finally said. You can rush a restoration, slap a coat of something over the cracks, call it finished. It looks fine for a season, and then the first hard winter comes and it falls apart all over again, usually worse than before. He turned to look at me directly. Or you can do it slowly. Clean everything down to the stone first. Figure out what's actually structural and what was just grime pretending to hold things together. It takes longer. But when you're done, the thing underneath was never actually broken. It was just buried. The water moved between us, catching light, throwing small broken reflections across his face. "Which one am I?" I asked, half joking, mostly not. "You tell me," he said. "You're the one who's been doing the work." I didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. So I let the silence sit there instead. Comfortable in a way silence with him had always been, even 16 years ago under a building overhang in the rain. My mother called every Sunday, a habit neither of us had ever discussed out loud, just a rhythm that had established itself sometime after my father died and never broken since. She lived outside Tampa now, in a small yellow house with a screened-in porch and a garden she fussed over with more patience than she'd ever shown me growing up, which I'd come to understand, as an adult, was simply her way of loving something without the complication of a person's feelings getting in the way. "So," she said, 3 weeks after I'd landed in Rome, in the particular tone she used when she was working up to something. "You're just going to live in Italy now." "That's the plan, Mom." "With the architect." "With my own apartment." "Near the architect." She was quiet for a second, which for my mother was its own kind of statement. "Your father always liked him. Did you know that? Back when you two were in school. He said, 'That Italian boy has manners.' Said it more than once, actually, usually right after meeting one of your other friends and being unimpressed." I hadn't known that. My father had died the year before my wedding to Grant, of a heart attack in his own driveway, quick and without warning, and I had spent a lot of energy since then trying not to imagine what he would have made of the 11 years that followed. My mother, I suspected, had spent just as much energy trying not to say it out loud. "He'd have liked seeing you do this," she said eventually. "Starting something of your own. You were always better at building things than you ever let yourself believe." "Mom, I'm allowed to say things like that. I'm your mother." A pause, then, gentler. "You sound different. Lighter. I don't know if you can hear it, but I can." "I can hear it," I admitted. "Good. Bring him home sometime. Not as an architect. As whatever he actually is to you, once you've figured that part out." I laughed, mostly at how transparently she'd been building to that line the entire call. "There's nothing to bring home yet." She said, in the specific tone mothers use when they've decided not to argue a point they're fully convinced they're right about. "Well, when there is." Priya flew out in May, ostensibly for a conference in Milan that she extended by 4 days, specifically to see me, though neither of us bothered pretending that was the real reason. She arrived at my studio in the middle of a client meeting, dropped her bag by the door, and waited with visible impatience until Alba had walked the last client out before throwing both arms around me. "This place," she said, turning in a slow circle to take in the skylight, the reclaimed shelving, the samples pinned to a corkboard along one wall. "Vivian, this is really yours. It's really mine. You built an entire business in 6 months. Do you understand how insane that is? Most people spend 6 months deciding what to have for breakfast after a divorce like yours." Over dinner that night, at a trattoria 2 streets from the studio that Ettore had personally vetted for me, she filled me in on everything Rome's distance had spared me the immediate horror of. Diane, apparently, had not taken the confrontation by the river well. She'd returned from Rome and, according to office gossip Priya was clearly delighted to relay, spent the better part of a month alternating between icy silence toward Brielle and sudden, unpredictable bursts of the exact behavior I'd warned would never actually change. Grant, for his part, had moved out of his mother's orbit almost entirely, renting a smaller place near his office, which Priya found almost touching until she remembered that he'd had 11 years to develop that particular spine and had only located it once every other option ran out. "He asked about you," Priya said carefully, over a glass of wine she was nursing more slowly than usual. Not like before. He didn't ask if you were coming back. He asked if you were doing okay. I think that's new. People can develop decency after the fact, I said. It doesn't erase what came before it. I know. I'm not asking you to forgive him. I just think it's worth noticing when someone finally does the bare minimum, if only so you can register how low that bar actually was. She turned her glass slowly by the stem. And the architect? I felt my face do something involuntary. Priya caught it immediately and grinned. That's a yes to something, even if you haven't said what yet. It's complicated. It's really not, she said. You've just spent 11 years married to a man who made everything feel complicated so you'd never notice how simple your own instincts actually were. This one's simple. I watched you talk about him for 10 straight minutes without once mentioning his job title, which is, historically, not something you've ever managed with Grant. I didn't have a rebuttal for that, so I drank my wine instead and let her be right about it in peace. Grant showed up in June, on a Thursday, with no warning at all, which in hindsight was probably the only way he could have managed it. If he'd told me in advance, I would simply have told him not to bother. I was leaving the studio a little after 6, going over paint samples in my head, when I saw him standing across the street in a suit clearly not built for Roman humidity, looking exactly like a man who had rehearsed this moment on an 11-hour flight, and was now discovering that none of the rehearsal had prepared him for how it would actually feel. Vivian. I stopped on the sidewalk. Alba beside me glanced between us and quietly said she'd lock up, and disappeared back through the studio door with the tact of someone who had clearly already heard the whole saga secondhand. You could have called, I said. You'd have told me not to come? That's correct. He looked older than I remembered, which was strange, given it had only been 8 months. There were new lines around his eyes, and he'd lost the particular polish he used to carry like armor. The suit fit slightly loose now, like he'd dropped weight too fast to have it altered. Can we get a coffee? He said. 10 minutes. I flew a very long way for 10 minutes. I considered telling him no, purely on principle, and then decided that whatever I still owed him, if anything, was 10 minutes of my own choosing, on my own terms, in a city that was entirely mine now, and not his. We sat at the same cafe by the river where I'd taken Diane months earlier, which felt, in retrospect, like some kind of poetic justice I hadn't planned for. He ordered an espresso and didn't drink it. The boys are doing well, he started. Both of them. Caught up on weight, no lasting issues as far as anyone can tell. I wanted you to know that. I'm glad. I named the smaller one Marcus, after your father. He said it carefully, watching my face for a reaction he clearly expected to be larger than it was. I don't know why. It felt right at the time. Brielle didn't object. I didn't say anything for a moment, turning that over. My father had liked Grant once, back before either of us had known better. There was something almost unbearably sad about that fact resurfacing 8 months too late to matter to anyone. Grant, why are you actually here? He turned his cup slowly on the saucer, not drinking. The same nervous gesture I remembered from 100 board meetings I'd sat through as his wife, present but decorative. I keep thinking about your message, the one you sent before you left, about the transfer that worked, about the fragmentation numbers. He looked up. I got tested again, after. Properly this time, not the version my doctor softened for me the first time around. It's worse than what you found out. It's not likely I'll be having any more children, even with Brielle, even if I wanted to. I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Because I spent 11 years blaming you for something that was never yours to carry, he said, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, his voice actually cracked. My mother blamed you. I let her. I let her say things to you I should have shut down the first time, and I told myself it was easier not to fight with her, that you were strong enough to handle it, that it would blow over. And the whole time the problem was sitting in my own body, and some part of me must have suspected it, because I never once volunteered to get tested until you forced my hand by leaving. You're right, I said evenly, because there was no version of disagreeing with any of that. That's exactly what happened. I'm not asking you to come back. He said it quickly, like he needed to get the sentence out before his nerve failed. I know that door is closed. I'm not stupid enough to think 8 months and an apology fixes 11 years. I just needed to say it to your face instead of a text message, because you deserve better than a text message, and I've spent our entire marriage giving you exactly that. The version of honesty that costs me the least. I looked out at the river for a while before I answered. A tour boat drifted past, tourists waving at no one in particular. Grant, I don't hate you. I want to be clear about that, because I think you came here braced for something angrier than what you're going to get. I don't hate you. I spent a long time being furious, and some of that hasn't entirely burned off yet, and it might never fully burn off. But hatred requires a kind of attention I'm not interested in giving you anymore. What I feel now is closer to relief. Relief that I'm not spending my life waiting for a man to notice me who's constitutionally incapable of noticing anyone but himself under pressure. He flinched at that, visibly, but didn't argue. Be a good father, I went on. That's the only thing I actually want from you at this point. Not for my sake, for theirs. Marcus and his brother didn't ask to be born into any of this, and they don't deserve a father who locks himself in an office every time something gets hard. You did that to me for 11 years. Don't do it to 2 infants who can't even leave the house yet. I'm trying, he said quietly. I know that doesn't count for much yet. It doesn't count for much yet, I agreed. But it's more than you were doing 8 months ago. So, keep trying. We sat another minute in a silence that wasn't quite comfortable, but also wasn't hostile. Just the particular quiet of 2 people who had run out of things that needed saying and hadn't yet figured out how to stand up and leave. Are you happy? He asked eventually, not quite looking at me. Out here. I don't need details. I'd like to know that leaving actually got you somewhere good, and not just away from somewhere bad. I thought about the studio with its leaking skylight, about Ettore's reading nook, about my mother's voice on the phone saying he was always better at building things than she let herself believe, about Matteo peeling an apple in one long, unbroken spiral while he told me about a difficult client he clearly adored. Yes, I said. I am. Something in his face eased slightly, a tension I hadn't fully registered until it released. Good, he said. That's good. That's all I wanted to know. He stood, left cash on the table for both coffees, even though his was untouched, and didn't ask for anything else. Not a hug, not a promise to keep in touch, not one more excuse to extend the conversation. It was, I realized as I watched him walk toward the taxi stand, possibly the single most respectful thing he had done in the entire 11 years I had known him. It had simply taken losing everything for him to figure out how. I didn't wave him off. I finished my own coffee, alone, watching the river, and felt something in my chest settle into a shape it hadn't held in a very long time. Not happiness, exactly, not yet. Something more like the quiet after a long, necessary storm, when you finally notice the ground is still there underneath you, solid, entirely load-bearing, waiting for you to build on it. I told Matteo about Grant's visit that same evening, sitting on his kitchen counter while he finished cleaning up from dinner, because I had promised myself, somewhere in the last 8 months, that I was done building a life around things left carefully unsaid. He listened without interrupting, drying a pan with more focus than the pan strictly required. How do you feel about it? He asked, once I'd finished. Lighter, like something I didn't know I was still carrying, finally got put down. Good. He hung the towel on its hook and leaned back against the counter, arms crossed, studying me in a way that wasn't quite a question, but was clearly building toward one. Can I ask you something? And you don't have to answer if it's unfair. Ask. Did any part of you want him to ask you to come back? Not because you'd have said yes. Just, did some part of you want to hear it? I thought about that honestly, because he'd earned an honest answer, and because I suspected the truthful one was more complicated than a clean no. There was a version of me, maybe 2 months ago, that would have wanted to hear it just to know I still could be wanted by someone who'd stopped noticing me for years. That version's mostly gone now. Today, when he said it, I just felt sorry for him. Not tempted. Sorry. Matteo nodded slowly, like he'd been braced for a harder answer and was recalibrating. That's a very specific kind of progress, being able to feel sorry for someone without it costing you anything. Is this the part where you tell me why you never married? I asked, half teasing, mostly genuinely curious, because in 16 years he had never once volunteered the full story, and I had never quite worked up the nerve to ask directly. He was quiet long enough that I thought he might deflect, the way he usually did with anything about himself. Then he pulled out a chair at the small kitchen table and sat, which felt, from him, like a kind of preamble. There was someone, for a while, in my late 20s. Chiara. We were together almost 4 years. She is, a good person. Steady, kind, wanted the ordinary things people are supposed to want. A house outside the city, children, Sunday dinners with both families crammed into one apartment. He turned his water glass slowly on the table, the same gesture I'd watched Grant make with his espresso cup that afternoon, though the resemblance ended entirely at the hands. I proposed. She said yes. We were engaged for about 8 months. What happened? She figured out, before I fully let myself admit it, that some part of me had never quite closed a door I should have closed years earlier. She didn't say it cruelly. She just sat me down one night and asked if I could honestly tell her that I thought about you as rarely as a person is supposed to think about someone they've decided not to be with. I couldn't answer that the way I needed to for the answer to be no. He looked up at me, steady, no particular self-pity in it, just a plain accounting of facts. She ended it herself. Told me I owed it to both of us not to spend a life half-present. It was the kindest thing anyone's ever done to me, and it took me a long time to see it that way, instead of just as something that hurt. Matteo, I'm sorry. I had no idea any of that happened. You weren't supposed to. I wasn't going to build a case for myself out of somebody else's broken engagement. That felt like using her twice. He shrugged, a small, economical movement. Afterward, I told myself I'd stop waiting for anything. I dated a little, here and there, nothing that stuck, and mostly I just built the firm and told myself I was content with that. And then, 8 months ago, you called me from an airport lounge in Newark and asked if I'd pick you up. And I realized I'd never actually stopped waiting. I'd just gotten quieter about it. I got down off the counter and crossed the kitchen and, without entirely planning to, put both arms around him. He held still for a second, surprised, and then his arms came up around me, careful, like he still wasn't sure he'd earned the right to hold on properly. 6 months, I said into his shoulder. I meant it. I'm not asking you to wait indefinitely on a maybe. I know, he said. I've waited on worse odds than that. The studio nearly went under in February, a fact I hadn't told anyone but Priya at the time, because admitting it out loud felt like admitting the whole enterprise had been a mistake, born out of grief rather than genuine talent. A client, a wealthy expat couple renovating a top-floor apartment near the Spanish Steps, pulled out 3 weeks into construction after a disagreement over budget that I still believe, to this day, was manufactured specifically so they could avoid paying the second installment of my fee. Italian contract law offered some protection, but pursuing it would have taken longer than the cash reserves Sergio had at the time could survive. Dario, my project manager, delivered the numbers to me in his usual blunt style over coffee. We had 6 weeks of payroll left if nothing new came in, and nothing new was currently in the pipeline. I didn't tell Matteo immediately. Some old, deeply worn groove in me wanted to solve it privately first, the way I'd solved every domestic crisis for 11 years without ever letting Grant see the effort underneath the calm surface. It took Alba, of all people, gently pointing out that keeping a business partner and a project manager in the dark about existential financial risk was not, in fact, the same skill as keeping a household running smoothly, and that the two instincts might be worth examining separately. So I told Matteo. He listened, asked precise questions about the contract dispute, and then did something I hadn't expected. He didn't offer to lend me money, didn't offer to fix it for me. He asked if I wanted his professional opinion as a fellow business owner, and when I said yes, he spent 40 minutes helping me draft a formal demand letter with language pulled from his own firm's contracts, then handed me back my own pen. "You send it," he said. "It needs to come from you, in your name, or it doesn't mean anything." I sent it. The couple settled 2 weeks later for 80% of what they owed, which Priya assured me, once I finally told her the whole saga, was a genuinely good outcome given how these things usually go. Kirkio survived. More than survived. The settlement, combined with 2 new referrals that came in that same month, meant that by April we'd hired Alba full-time and started looking at a slightly larger space. I thought about that whole ordeal a great deal afterward, mostly because of how it had ended, not with someone rescuing me, but with someone handing me back my own pen and trusting me to use it. Summer settled over Rome the way it always seems to in every account I'd ever read of the city, thick and gold and unhurried, tourists thinning slightly in the worst of the July heat, while the actual residents adjusted their whole schedules around the hours between 2 and 5 in the afternoon, when the shutters came down and the city more or less agreed, collectively, to stop pretending it wasn't too hot to function. Matteo and I settled into something that had no name yet, but had, unmistakably, a shape. Dinners most nights, sometimes cooked, sometimes not. Long, aimless walks after the heat broke in the evenings, ending more often than not at the same small fountain in Trastevere, half hidden behind its overgrown jasmine, where we'd stand for a few minutes doing nothing in particular before heading home. There was a night in late July, walking back from dinner, when he stopped under a street lamp and looked at me in a way that made it very clear he was about 3 seconds from saying something we'd both agreed, back in December, to hold off on for a while longer. "Don't," I said, half laughing, mostly serious. "We agreed on 6 months." "I'm aware of the terms," he said, not moving. "I'm allowed to look at you, though. That wasn't part of the agreement. You're impossible. You said that in college, too. 16 years, and it's still the exact same complaint." He reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind my ear, the same gesture, I realized with a small jolt, that had appeared in that photograph from 2008, the one where I'd been too young to read what was written all over his face. His fingers were rough in the specific way of someone who still drafted by hand as often as he could get away with, warm despite the evening having cooled. "Let's go," he said, pulling his hand back, voice settling into its usual dry, unbothered register. "You have a site visit tomorrow. Don't stay up arguing with me about a deadline neither of us controls." I swatted at him. He dodged, laughing, and quickened his pace just enough to stay out of reach, and we walked the rest of the way home with our shadows stretched long and close together across the cobblestones, the particular gentleness of a Roman summer night settling over both of us, like something we'd earned rather than been given. Diane sent me one letter, an actual letter, handwritten, forwarded through Priya's office because she apparently didn't trust the Roman postal system with anything that mattered to her. It arrived in August, nearly 10 months after I'd left, and I almost didn't open it. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. Diane wasn't built for those, any more than Grant had been built, until recently, for accountability. It was 3 pages of her particular brand of self-justification, threaded through with what I eventually recognized, on a second read, as something close to grief. She wrote about watching Brielle struggle with 2 infants and a man who still didn't know how to show up for anyone, and how it had made her see, for the first time, that the problem had never actually been which young woman occupied the role. She wrote that she didn't expect me to forgive her, and that she wasn't asking me to, but that she wanted me to know she'd finally understood. Too late to matter to me, she admitted, but understood all the same. That a woman who complains this specifically and this constantly about every daughter-in-law she's ever had is probably not identifying a pattern in the women. She's describing herself. I read it twice, and then I put it in a drawer, and I didn't write back. Not out of cruelty. Some doors don't need to be slammed shut to stay closed. They just need to be left exactly where they are. Grant's updates arrived less frequently now, spaced out enough that each one felt like an actual event rather than a wound reopening. In September, he wrote to say the boys had started sleeping through the night, that Marcus had said his first word, a garbled attempt at dog, directed at a neighbor's aging retriever, and that he'd taken both of them to a pediatric appointment alone for the first time, without Brielle or a nanny or an assistant standing between him and the actual, unglamorous work of parenting. He didn't ask me to be impressed by any of it. He just reported it, the way you'd tell an old colleague about a project you were finally getting right after years of getting it wrong. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I was capable of being genuinely glad for 2 children I would never meet. Born out of circumstances I still had complicated feelings about, being raised, however imperfectly, a little better than they might otherwise have been. Brielle wrote once more that autumn, a longer message than her usual brief professional check-ins about the store. She told me she'd moved out of Grant's apartment and into a place of her own nearby, not out of any dramatic rupture. She was careful to clarify, but because she'd realized, watching the 2 of us, meaning I understood, watching my own trajectory from a distance, through the occasional detail that reached her secondhand, that she didn't actually know who she was outside of being someone's girlfriend, someone's mother, someone Diane Whitlock had once decided to evaluate like a piece of furniture. She wanted to find out, she wrote, before it became too late to ask the question at all. She'd enrolled in night classes, she added, business courses at a community college near her new apartment, with some vague idea of eventually running her clothing line without needing anyone else's name on the funding. I want to build something that's actually mine, she wrote. The way you did. I know I don't get to compare myself to you exactly. I just mean I finally understand what you were trying to tell me that night on the phone, about not hanging your whole worth on someone else's decisions. It took losing the version of security I thought I had to actually hear it. I wrote back that I was proud of her, and meant it more fully than I might have predicted, a year earlier, standing behind a lilac bush watching her hand rest on the curve of her own uncertain future. People are rarely only the worst thing they've done to you. She had been, unmistakably, the worst thing that had happened to my marriage. She was also, it turned out, simply a very young woman who had climbed onto a bus with a rusted-through frame because nobody had ever taught her how to check first, and who was now, slowly and without much help, learning to build something of her own instead. I understood that particular education better than almost anyone alive. I wasn't in a position to withhold my respect for her finally getting it, regardless of the cost it had taken both of us to arrive at the same lesson from opposite directions. Not every night in Rome was gold light and steamed fish and easy silences. There was a night in early October, close to the 1-year mark since I'd walked down the flagstone path at the house on Larkspur Lane, when I woke at 3 in the morning from a dream I couldn't fully hold on to. Something about a hospital corridor, a nurse asking if there was someone to call, my own voice saying no, there wasn't. On a loop that wouldn't resolve into anything more specific than the particular cold sweat it left behind. I sat up in the dark, heart going too fast, and for a long, disoriented minute I couldn't remember which apartment I was in, which country, which version of my life. It passed, the way it always eventually did, but it left behind the specific aftertaste of 11 years I hadn't fully finished metabolizing, no matter how much better the days had gotten. I didn't call Matteo. It was 3 in the morning, and some part of the old instinct, don't burden anyone, manage it yourself, that's what a good woman does, still flared up in moments like that, quieter than it used to be but not entirely gone. Instead, I made tea, sat at the window, and watched the empty street below until the bakery's shutter finally rolled up at 7, and the ordinary business of the day started again, without me having to do anything at all to deserve it. I told Matteo about it 2 days later, not because I needed to, but because I'd promised myself I would stop hoarding the hard parts the way I used to. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't ask why I hadn't called him at 3 in the morning, though I suspect he wanted to. That's going to keep happening sometimes, he said instead, matter of fact, no pity in it. Not because you're not healing, just because 11 years doesn't get erased by 12 months, even good ones. It'll get quieter. It might not ever go completely silent, and that's all right too. How do you know that? I don't, really. I'm mostly guessing, based on watching my own mother after my father died. It took her about 4 years before the night stopped being the hardest part. She still has bad ones sometimes, and it's been almost 20 years. He reached over and took my hand, not urgently, just present. Next time, though, call me, even at 3 in the morning, especially at 3 in the morning. I don't want to be someone who needs that. Vivian. He said my name the way he always did, unhurried, like it was a word he genuinely enjoyed the shape of. Needing someone at 3 in the morning isn't the same thing as being unable to function without them. You built an entire company from nothing this year. You stood in a cafe and dismantled Diane Whitlock in about 4 sentences. You are, by any reasonable measure, one of the least dependent people I've ever known. Letting one person in on the bad nights doesn't undo any of that. I didn't have an argument for that, so I let it sit, and the next time the dream came back, 3 weeks later, I called him at 2:30, and he answered on the second ring, and didn't ask anything beyond whether I wanted him to come over or just stay on the phone. I asked him to come over. He was there in 11 minutes, still in the clothes he'd apparently fallen asleep in, and made tea in my kitchen without being asked, and sat with me until the sky started going gray, and neither of us said very much at all, because by then we'd both learned that some of the most important things between two people don't require saying out loud to be entirely, permanently true. Churchio landed its largest project yet in October. A full restoration of a small, half-forgotten library in the Testaccio neighborhood, funded by a cultural foundation that had seen the pasticceria renovation and wanted something with, in their words, the same respect for what a space used to be. It was the kind of project that would have terrified me a year earlier. 5 months of work, a construction crew of 14, a historical preservation board with opinions about every doorframe. I said yes within a week of the pitch meeting, and did not once, that entire process, feel the specific dread that used to accompany any decision of consequence in my old life, the dread of getting something wrong in front of people whose approval I'd spent years chasing. Alba ran point on the interior finishes. Dario kept the contractors honest. I spent most evenings at the site itself, once the crews had cleared out, sitting on an overturned crate in the half-gutted main room, sketching by the light of a single work lamp, trying to figure out how to let 100-year-old reading room breathe again without erasing the particular, slightly shabby dignity that had made 3 generations of the neighborhood love it in the first place. Matteo came by more evenings than not, ostensibly to consult on the structural work, though I suspected at least some of those visits had less to do with load-bearing calculations and more to do with simply wanting to watch me work. He never said as much. He'd just settle onto an adjacent crate with a thermos of coffee he'd share without asking, and occasionally offer an opinion when I asked for one, and mostly just exist beside me in the particular comfortable silence that had, over the better part of a year, become the closest thing to home I had anywhere in the world. "You know," he said one evening, watching me erase and redraw the same sketch for the 4th time, "the version from 20 minutes ago was better. It had a structural flaw in the shelving span. It had soul. You can fix the shelving span. You can't always get the soul back once you've drawn over it 3 more times chasing perfect." I looked up at him, lamplight catching the gray at his temples, 16 years of patience sitting easily on him in a way that would have looked, on almost anyone else, like something closer to resignation. "Is that a design note or a metaphor?" I asked. "Would it matter which?" he said, "if both were true?" I didn't have an answer, so I went back to the sketch and left the small flaw in the shelving span exactly where it was. And it turned out, 3 weeks later when the actual carpenters built it, that he'd been right about all of it. The library reopened in the first week of November, almost exactly a year after I'd wheeled a suitcase down a flagstone path in Connecticut and watched a marriage disappear in a rearview mirror. The neighborhood turned out in numbers I hadn't expected. Ettore closed the pasticceria for the afternoon and brought over trays of pastries anyway, refusing to let anyone call it a donation. Elderly women who'd apparently been coming to that library since they were girls stood in the restored reading room with their hands pressed to their mouths, looking up at the cleaned plasterwork ceiling like they were seeing it for the first time, which, in a sense, they were. Decades of grime and old varnish had dulled the original detailing almost past recognition before we'd started. The Foundation's director gave a short speech, thanked the crew, thanked Sergio by name, and made a point of mentioning that the studio had come in under budget and ahead of schedule, which drew a small ripple of applause that embarrassed me more than any of the design compliments that followed. Matteo stood near the back the entire time, hands in his coat pockets, watching me field questions from a local paper's arts correspondent with an expression I'd started to recognize as his particular version of pride. Quiet, unhurried, entirely without the need to insert himself into a moment that wasn't his. Afterward, once the crowd had thinned and Alba and Dario had gone off to celebrate properly at a bar around the corner, Matteo and I stood alone in the reading room, the last of the afternoon light coming through the tall restored windows and pooling gold across the new-old floorboards. "A year," he said, not quite a question. "A year, next week." He looked around the room slowly, the way he looked at every finished space, cataloging details out of habit. "You know what I keep thinking, standing here." "What?" "That a room like this, everyone assumes the hard part is the big gesture. Tear down the wall, replace the roof, gut the whole thing and start fresh." He turned to face me. But the actual hard part was always smaller than that. It was deciding which cracks were structural and which ones were just old grime pretending to hold the place together. Cleaning it back, slowly, down to what was actually load-bearing. That's the part nobody claps for at an opening. But it's the only part that matters. Long term. I felt my throat tighten slightly. in the specific way it did whenever he said something that landed closer to the center of things than either of us usually allowed ourselves to get out loud. Mateo. It's been almost a year. He went very still. The same stillness I remembered from a kitchen table in December, the night I'd asked him to wait. I know, he said carefully. I wasn't counting exactly, but I wasn't not counting either. You said 6 months, then a year. If 6 wasn't enough, then 2. If a year wasn't enough. I remember what I said. I don't need the extra year. I turned to face him fully, the gold light catching half his face, leaving the other half in shadow. I spent this last one figuring out who I am without anyone's name attached to mine. I know that now. I built something real, on my own terms, and I know I could keep building it alone if I had to. I don't have to, though. That's different from not being able to. I want to build the next part of it with you. Not because I need someone. Because I've chosen you clearly with both eyes open, in a way I never actually got to choose anything 11 years ago. He didn't say anything for a moment, and in the silence I watched something in his face come undone very quietly, the particular composure he'd worn like a second skin for 16 years finally, gently, giving way. Say that again, he said. The part about choosing. I've chosen you, I said. Clearly. On purpose. Not out of loneliness. Not out of gratitude for the airport pickup. Not because you were kind to me when I had nowhere else to go. Because in the middle of building an entire life from nothing, you were the one constant I kept choosing every single day without anyone forcing my hand. He crossed the small distance between us and took my face in both hands, careful the way he was careful with everything, his thumbs at my jaw, and looked at me for a long moment before he kissed me. 16 years, by his own count, compressed into something unhurried and entirely without the frantic edge I might have expected, because we had, both of us, already done all our waiting. For the record, he said afterward, forehead resting against mine, I would genuinely have waited the full 2 years. I want you to know that wasn't a bluff. I know, I said. That's exactly why I didn't need you to. We left the library as the streetlights were coming on, walking without any particular destination, the way we always had, and ended up, as we so often did, at the small half-hidden fountain in Trastevere, water running clear over stone that had been cleaned and repatinated back to something better than new. So, Mateo said, sitting on the low wall beside the basin, watching the water catch the last of the streetlight. What happens now? Now, I said, sitting beside him. I think we just keep doing what we've been doing, except out loud, instead of quietly, the way we were pretending we weren't. That sounds suspiciously uneventful for a year this dramatic. I've had enough events for one lifetime. I'd like uneventful for a while. Uneventful, with you, sounds like the best offer I've had in 11 years. He laughed, low and genuine, and put an arm around my shoulders, and we sat there for a long while, not talking, just watching the water move and the city settle into its evening rhythms around us, a couple arguing cheerfully somewhere behind us about whose turn it was to cook, a scooter buzzing past too fast for the narrow street, the bakery 2 doors down finally going dark for the night, its owner's silhouette visible for a moment through the window as she counted the till. Somewhere across an ocean, 2 little boys I would probably never meet were, I hoped, being tucked into bed by a father finally learning, late but not too late, how to show up. Somewhere a woman named Brielle was figuring out, the hard way, exactly the thing I'd spent a year figuring out myself, that you are yourself first, before anyone else's wife or anyone else's mother, and that the sooner you learn it, the less it costs you. Somewhere Diane Whitlock was sitting with a letter she'd never gotten an answer to, learning, perhaps too slowly and too late for it to matter to anyone but herself, that the problem had never been which woman occupied the role. And here, in a city I hadn't chosen so much as returned to, in the particular gold light of a Roman evening a year after I'd walked away from everything I thought I was supposed to want, I sat beside a man who had waited 16 years without once making the waiting my burden to carry, and felt, for the first time in longer than I could clearly remember, entirely, uncomplicatedly whole. Not repaired, not patched over. Whole. The way a thing is whole once someone has finally taken the time to clean it back to the stone and find out what was load-bearing all along. I reached over and took his hand. He laced his fingers through mine without a word, the way he always did, like it was the simplest, most obvious thing in the world, and we sat there together as the streetlights came fully on and the water kept moving in the dark, clear all the way down to the bottom of the basin, exactly the way it was always supposed to run. Matteo's mother, Lucia, lived in an apartment near the Aventine Hill that had belonged to her own parents, filled with the specific density of furniture and photographs that accumulates over 60 years in one place. I met her properly for the first time 3 weeks after the library opening. At a Sunday lunch, Matteo had clearly been delaying arranging out of some mixture of nerves I found unexpectedly endearing in a man who otherwise handled everything with such even composure. "He talked about you for 16 years," Lucia informed me within the first 10 minutes, setting down a dish of artichokes before I'd even finished taking off my coat. Her English accented but entirely fluent, the legacy of the years the family had spent in Boston. Not constantly, he's not dramatic like that. But every so often some woman would come along and I would ask, "Is this someone serious?" And he would get this particular look, like a door closing gently, and say, "Not yet." And I would think, "Ah, still her then." "Mama," Matteo said, from the kitchen doorway, in the tone of a grown man who had clearly hoped his mother might exercise some restraint on this particular subject, and had known, the entire drive over, that she wouldn't. "I'm not saying anything untrue," Lucia said, entirely unbothered, waving a hand at him. "Sit. Eat. Vivian, tell me about this library you finished. He showed me photographs. The plasterwork ceiling. Is that original?" We talked for 2 hours, mostly about work, a little about my family, a little about Chiara, whom Lucia mentioned once, gently, without any apparent awkwardness. "A lovely girl. We still send a card at Christmas. These things don't have to be complicated if everyone behaves like adults about it." And by the time we left, my face ached faintly from laughing at Matteo's obvious discomfort every time his mother produced another anecdote from his adolescence that he clearly considered classified. "She likes you," he said on the walk back, hands in his pockets, a little more relaxed than he'd been all afternoon. "She likes an audience for stories about you. I happen to be a convenient one." "Both things can be true." He glanced sideways at me. "For what it's worth, she's not an easy woman to win over. She thought Chiara was lovely, but never entirely stopped treating her like a guest, 4 years in. She's treated you like family since about the second course." I didn't have a response for that beyond reaching for his hand, which seemed, in the moment, to say enough. I flew back to the States in December, a year and a month after I'd left it, ostensibly for my mother's 65th birthday, though we both understood, without saying so directly, that it was also a kind of test. Could I go back to that stretch of coastline, to the particular smell of Connecticut in winter, without the ground shifting under me the way it once would have? Matteo came with me. My mother met him at the arrivals gate in Tampa holding a hand-lettered sign that said, in block letters clearly modeled on the one he'd held up for me at Fiumicino, "Mr. Conti," which made him laugh so hard he had to set his bag down. "Your father would have loved this," she told me later, watching Matteo help clear the dinner table without being asked, a habit that apparently impressed her more than any of his professional credentials combined. A man who clears a table without being told is a man who notices things. Your father used to say that was the whole secret, really. Everything else is negotiable. On the second day of the trip, without entirely planning it, I found myself driving past the house on Larkspur Lane. It wasn't intentional, a wrong turn, a familiar road, the kind of muscle memory that outlasts the reason for it. But once I realized where I was, I didn't turn around. The house looked the same, boxwoods trimmed by someone else's hand now, a child's tricycle abandoned on its side near the front steps that hadn't been there in my time. I slowed, looked at it for perhaps 10 seconds, and then kept driving, and felt, to my genuine surprise, almost nothing at all. Not grief, not triumph. Just the mild, distant recognition of a place that had once mattered enormously and now simply didn't. The way a childhood address stops meaning anything once you've built enough new rooms to live in instead. "You okay?" Mateo asked from the passenger seat, watching my face rather than the road. "I think I actually am." And saying it out loud, I found it was entirely true. Grant reached out while I was in the country, careful and brief, asking only if I'd be willing to meet the boys once, someday, whenever felt right to me. No pressure attached. I told him not yet, maybe someday, and meant both halves of that answer. Some doors get to stay ajar without needing to be walked all the way through. Sergio's library restoration was written up that winter in a small but well-regarded design publication, a 2-page spread with photographs of the reading room bathed in the particular gold light Rome seems to specialize in, and a paragraph, near the end, that I read probably a dozen times before I let myself fully believe it was about me. Vivian Whitlock's approach treats restoration not as a return to some fixed original state, but as an ongoing negotiation between what a space once was and what the people using it need it to become. It is, in its own quiet way, a philosophy as much as a design practice. I hadn't set out to build a philosophy. I'd set out, honestly, to survive a year without falling apart in public, and to prove to myself, mostly, that I could build something that hadn't been handed to me by a man's checkbook. That the two things had turned into the same project felt, by the time I read that paragraph on my kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me, less like an accident and more like the inevitable result of finally being allowed to build anything at all. 2 more foundations called that spring, inquiring about future projects. Alba got her name on the byline of the next commission, which she deserved, and which I made sure of personally. Dario negotiated Sergio's first proper office lease, a floor above the original Monty storefront, with a skylight that, this time, I fixed before we ever held a single client meeting under it. We were married the following autumn, quietly, in the garden of Lucia's building, 12 people total, including my mother, who flew in a week early and spent most of it arguing cheerfully with Lucia about whose recipe for the wedding lunch was more authentic, a debate that appeared to have no actual resolution and that both women seemed to enjoy far too much to want one. I wore a simple ivory dress I'd found in a small shop near the studio. No veil, no elaborate production, nothing that required approval from anyone but myself. Mateo wore the same gray suit he'd worn to my first wedding 16 years earlier, a fact I only found out afterward, from his mother, who'd apparently kept it pressed in a garment bag the entire time, on the theory that some things are worth being patient for. Priya flew in and cried through the entire 5-minute ceremony, loudly enough that Lucia handed her a second handkerchief halfway through. My mother gave a short, unsentimental toast that ended with the line, "She was always better at building things than she let herself believe," and I'm glad she finally found someone who noticed that, instead of someone who needed her not to, which got a laugh. And, from me, considerably more than that. Afterward, once the small crowd had drifted off toward the wine and the last of the autumn light, Mateo and I stood alone for a minute at the edge of the garden, looking out over the rooftops toward the river. 16 years and a divorce to get here, I said. I'd have taken longer, he said. I told you that in the library. It wasn't a bluff. I know. That's still exactly why I didn't need you to. He laughed, low and easy, and pulled me against him, and we stood there together as the light went gold and then rose, and then finally, gently, dark, in a city that had taught me, patiently and without asking anything of me in return, that the things worth having are almost never the ones handed to you whole. They're the ones you're willing to clean back to the stone yourself. Slowly, one true thing at a time, until you finally find out what was load-bearing all along. It was me. It had always, quietly, been me. Alba had her own reasons for understanding, better than most 26-year-olds I'd met, exactly what it costs a person to spend years making herself smaller for someone else's comfort. She told me the story slowly, over the first several months we worked together, in fragments dropped between conversations about tile grout and lighting plans, the way people tend to share the things that actually matter, sideways, almost accidentally, when the direct question would have felt like too much. She'd trained in Florence under a well-regarded senior designer who had, by her account, taken credit for nearly every meaningful idea she'd contributed over 3 years of employment, while simultaneously convincing her that she wasn't yet ready to put her own name on anything. She'd left only when a friend, seeing a magazine spread crediting her mentor for a bathroom layout Alba had drawn herself down to the tile pattern, had bluntly asked her how much longer she planned to let this continue. I didn't recognize it as a problem while I was inside it, she told me one evening, the two of us finishing a set of drawings long after Dario had gone home. It just felt like paying dues, like this was simply what the first several years of a career were supposed to feel like. Invisible, a little humiliating, temporary. I kept telling myself, once I've proven myself enough, it'll be different. How long did you tell yourself that? 3 years. I might still be telling myself that, honestly, if you hadn't put my name on the byline for the second foundation project without my asking you to. I hadn't thought of it, at the time, as a particularly significant gesture. It had simply seemed like the honest accounting of who'd done the work. But watching her face when she saw her own name in print for the first time, I understood, more clearly than I had in months of processing my own history, exactly how much smaller the world can make a woman feel, long before any one dramatic betrayal ever arrives to explain it clearly. Grant hadn't invented that particular mechanism. He'd simply been the version of it that happened to walk into my life at 20. You'll do the same for someone eventually, I told her. Once you've got your own studio or your own team, it's the only interest that actually compounds. She looked skeptical, in the specific way of someone who hasn't yet fully believed the good thing that's happening to her is real. You really think I'll have my own studio? I think you'll have 3 of them within 10 years, and I fully intend to remind you of this conversation at the opening of the first one. She did, eventually, though that part of the story belongs somewhere further down the road than this one, in a chapter I wasn't yet living the year all of this happened. The most difficult client Sergio took on that first year was a Milanese businessman renovating a countryside villa he intended to use perhaps 3 weeks a year, whose specific request, relayed through an assistant, since he rarely appeared on site himself, was that the finished space photograph impressively for a magazine spread without any particular concern for whether it functioned as a place an actual person might want to live. I pushed back on nearly every proposal his office sent over. He wanted a kitchen with no visible storage, all cabinetry hidden behind flush paneling because visible cabinet pulls photographed as clutter. I pointed out, as diplomatically as I could manage, that a kitchen nobody could actually find a spoon in wasn't good design, it was a stage set, and that Sergio's name wasn't going on a stage set regardless of how well it might photograph. His assistant relayed a few days later that the client found my pushback unusual, since most designers simply gave him what he asked for. Most designers, I wrote back. In an email Alba still quotes back to me occasionally when she needs to make a point to a difficult client of her own, are optimizing for your signature on an invoice. I'm optimizing for whether you'll actually want to live in the space in 5 years, or whether you'll quietly resent it the way people always eventually resent things built entirely for how they look rather than how they work. I'm happy to build you the first version if that's genuinely what you want. I just want you to know, in writing, that it's not the version I'd recommend. He came around eventually, not out of any particular conversion to my point of view, I suspect, but because his assistant mentioned, almost as an aside, that the Foundation Library project had gotten written up in a magazine specifically for the quality of its restraint, and vanity, it turns out, can occasionally be redirected toward better instincts than it started with. The finished villa kitchen had visible cabinet pulls, drawers a person could actually locate a spoon in without an engineering degree, and photographed, in the end, just as well as the version he'd originally asked for. Better, if you asked Alba, who'd fought the hardest for the compromise on the pantry layout. I thought about that project a great deal in the months afterward, mostly because of how closely it mirrored a lesson I'd spent 11 years failing to apply to my own life. A house that photographs well for other people's approval and a house you can actually live inside are not automatically the same house. It had taken me until I was 34 and $15 million and an ocean's worth of distance to fully understand the difference. I was, at least, getting the chance to teach it to other people faster than it had been taught to me. We had a standing dinner, by that second spring, most Sunday evenings. Matteo, Alba, Dario, Ettore, whenever the pasticceria's schedule allowed. Occasionally Priya over video call from whatever city her work had scattered her to that week. It wasn't a tradition anyone had formally declared. It had simply accumulated, the way found families tend to, out of a series of individually unremarkable decisions to keep showing up. Ettore brought pastries, he insisted, every single week, were simply leftovers that would otherwise go to waste. A fiction everyone at the table had long since agreed to accept, without comment, since the alternative was watching him look genuinely wounded at the suggestion he might simply be generous on purpose. Dario brought wine from a cousin's vineyard outside Orvieto, and opinions about whichever football match had most recently disappointed him. Alba, increasingly, brought a boyfriend named Tommaso, a structural engineer Dario had introduced her to the previous winter, whose main personality trait, as far as I could determine after 4 months, was finding Alba's every sentence quietly, thoroughly delightful. Which struck me, watching them, as a considerably lower bar than most relationships require, and also, apparently, an entirely sufficient one. Matteo cooked more often than not, the same handful of dishes rotating through with small variations, sea bass appearing with a frequency that had become its own long-running joke at the table. You could learn a second recipe, Dario told him at least once a month. I have several, Matteo would reply, without looking up from whatever he was deboning. I simply choose not to use them on people I actually like. It was, that first year, the closest thing I'd had to a genuine family table since long before I'd married into one that had never actually wanted me at it. Not the version performed for holidays and photographs, but the unglamorous, recurring, entirely voluntary kind, made up of people who kept showing up on a Tuesday for no reason except that they wanted to. Nobody at that table had ever once commented on my chances of conceiving, or my usefulness to anyone's family name, or whether I was sufficiently presentable for the room. They simply passed the wine, argued cheerfully about football and tile grout, and made space for whoever else needed a seat that week, which turned out, in the end, to be the entire secret Diane Whitlock had spent 30-some years as a mother-in-law, never once managing to learn. People ask me sometimes, usually at some point during a client dinner or a design conference, how I ended up rebuilding an entire life in a city I'd only ever visited as someone else's guest. They mean it as small talk, mostly, a conversational bridge between the wine and whatever they actually want to discuss. And I've learned to give the short version: a difficult marriage, a generous settlement, an old friend with a spare key, and an extraordinary amount of patience. The longer version, the one I only tell people who've actually earned it, is that I spent 11 years believing my value was something other people got to calculate for me. My body's cooperation, my usefulness to a family name, my ability to stay quiet and presentable in rooms built for someone else's comfort. It took losing all of it at once, all in a single autumn afternoon on a flagstone path, to understand that the calculation had been wrong from the very beginning. Not because the answer came out badly, because I'd never once been the one holding the pen. If I could go back and say one thing to the woman dragging that suitcase down the path, past the lilac bush, past a man who couldn't be bothered to walk her to her own car, I don't think I'd tell her it was going to be all right. Though it was. I think I'd tell her something closer to what Mateo told me. Standing in a half-restored library a year later, gold light pooling across floorboards, someone had finally taken the time to clean back to what they'd always actually been underneath. That the hard part was never the dramatic gesture, the leaving, the signing, the flight across an ocean. The hard part, the only part that ever really mattered, was the slow work afterward of figuring out which parts of yourself were structural and which parts had only ever been grime somebody else convinced you was load-bearing. Everything else, the studio, the fountain, the found family gathered every Sunday around a table that never once asked what I was worth, was simply what happened once I'd finally done that work properly and let the light back in. I think about the version of me who once believed a woman's worth could be measured against a checklist. Usefulness, presentability, the capacity to produce an heir. And I feel, mostly, a kind of distant tenderness for her. The same tenderness you'd feel watching a much younger sister make a mistake you can already see coming, but know she has to make anyway. She wasn't foolish. She was simply doing the only math anyone had ever taught her, with the only numbers anyone had ever handed her, in a system designed from the outset to make sure she never once suspected there might be other numbers available. I know better now, not because someone finally explained it to me, but because I spent a year building the alternative with my own hands, one commission and one difficult client, and one Sunday dinner at a time, until the new equation simply became the only one I trusted anymore. That, I think, is the actual inheritance this whole ordeal left me, not the 15 million, though I won't pretend that didn't make the landing considerably softer than it might otherwise have been. The real inheritance was the plain, hard-won knowledge that nobody else ever gets to hold the pen on what I'm worth again. Not a mother-in-law with a spreadsheet of expectations, not a husband who mistook silence for peace, just me, and whoever I choose, freely, with both eyes open, to build the next room with.